Big, muscular, powerful. The C-17 pulls its weight.
It's there for immediate response to an emergency anywhere around the world.
It's a flying warehouse that handles like a fighter.
The sheer power of the aircraft is amazing.
And elbows its way into the toughest battles.
It was the first time a C-17 had done an airdrop in a combat situation.
But Big comes at a high price.
It was a very complex program to begin with, very challenging technologically.
Now, we bring you the inside story of a plane that battled more than a decade of controversy.
Members of Congress are asking, is the American taxpayer getting his money's worth?
When the Air Force wants to throw its weight around, it sends a C-17. In 2007, Iraq. 4 years into the U.S. occupation, sectarian violence destroys a fragile peace.
A major attack this morning. This will undoubtedly ignite fury among the Shia community, ratchet up sectarian tension.
President George W. Bush announces a dramatic shift in U.S. strategy, a massive surge in troops.
I've committed more than 20,000 additional American troops to Iraq.
20,000 troops means a whole lot of infrastructure. So the Air Force brings in its favorite heavy hauler, the C-17. The C-17 Globemaster, known to its crews as Moose. This big gray beast is the most flexible military transport aircraft in the world. The C-17's cargo compartment is a whopping 18 feet wide by 12.5 feet high.
We're located in the back of the C-17 aircraft. The ramp on the C-17 can hold up to 40,000 pounds of cargo. We do a lot of cargo equipment that's loaded onto pallets. Main way of loading those is on the K-loader. We bring the K-loader up to the back of the jet, and then we turn over rollers throughout the cargo floor, and that provides us with the ease of on and offloading these pallets. We just roll them right into position, lock them in, and that's that.
That's that for the pallets. Other kinds of cargo roll in all by themselves.
Different kinds of vehicles that we can put on there are Humvees. We can put motorized vehicles, civilian trucks. We can bring up as heavy as an M1 tank, which weighs 130,000 pounds.
The C-17 also carries cargo even more precious than frontline equipment: people.
As far as passengers go, we can carry 27 on each of the sidewall seats, and then if we need to, we can bring down the centerline seats and carry up to 138. Depending on how many passengers we're going to take, it can take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour to reconfigure the aircraft to carry as many passengers as we need.
The only drawback, comfort.
It's not the most comfortable jet to fly on. You can see that's the lack of windows, so it does get a little claustrophobic and tight with the passengers.
No other Air Force plane gets as many troops into the battlefield fast. And there's one configuration that lets the C-17 go the distance when it needs to get them out safely too. July 3rd, Balad Air Base, just north of Baghdad. C-17s line the runway as far as the eye can see.
The reason that we had been deployed to Iraq was to move cargo and supplies and people back and forth.
Major Corbett Buffton was a C-17 pilot during Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Due to the IED threat, they had decided to use airlift to basically take convoys off the road. A typical mission for us would be bringing stuff from the north to the south, which are, by flight time, less than 7 minutes.
Buffton and his crew prepare for a routine cargo run. At first, it seems like just another hot day in the desert.
It was a standard airlift mission. I think we were taking some strikers up north.
But before they can board, the C-17 crew gets new orders. They've been tapped for a much more complicated mission.
They notified us that our mission had changed and we were going to do a medevac. In this case, we were taking somebody who had suffered a knife injury to the head.
The standard medevac flight is just 6 hours, but a knife wound to the head is not a run-of-the-mill injury. So this won't be a run-of-the-mill flight.
Usually what happens is they take them up to Germany. In this case, it was different because they said, well, you're taking this guy all the way to back to the United States.
Bufton's crew readies the aircraft. A medical team transforms the C-17's cargo hold into an emergency room.
The crew was 4 pilots, 2 loadmasters, and a crew chief. And then we had 7 other medical personnel on board, specifically for the patients.
The Air Force has 5 different airframes for medevac missions, but the C-17 is its Cadillac.
The great thing about the C-17, it was designed and built for aeromedical evacuation. We can be considered a flying hospital.
Medical-grade oxygen, call buttons, temperature control, features that other aircraft just don't have. It takes a medevac team just 20 minutes to configure the cargo for 1 soldier, or a whole platoon.
With the equipment that's on the aircraft, we can set up 3 of these litter stanchions. During contingencies, we can set up 12 litters on the aircraft, which is 48 patients. We have to be ready at all times to accept any kind of patients that come through and to take them back to a higher facility of care.
In Iraq, Bufton and his crew rush to get their C-17 airborne. The medical team brings the wounded soldier on board.
Anytime you're flying people versus cargo, you fly differently. You're a little bit more deliberate about things, and the time is more critical as well.
With this mission, Bufton isn't just concerned about speed. He's worried about altitude.
Your whole body swells the higher up you go. So the higher you go up, the more that air is going to expand.
And for a patient with a knife in his head, that can be deadly.
If you think about your head as a little balloon, that balloon's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger the higher you go. So we want to minimize that.
The C-17 usually cruises at 35 to 37,000 feet. Because of the patient, it has to fly lower.
The medical team wanted us to keep the pressure in the cabin around 4,000 feet. The C-17 is very well designed that it can maintain a lower cabin pressure altitude. However, you do have to fly lower to maintain the lowest cabin pressure altitude. So that limited us to around 26,000 feet.
Flying lower means burning more fuel. Another complication for the fuel-hogging aircraft. The C-17 burns 12.5 gallons for every single mile. Believe it or not, that's not bad for a transport aircraft. The C-5 Galaxy sucks down 19 gallons for every mile it flies. The C-130 is the best of the transports. For every mile it goes, it needs just 3 gallons to get there. On this mission, there's no time to gas up on land. So Bufton plans to refuel in the air.
You're going to save hours if you just do the air refueling, which is exactly the whole point of the mission.
The C-17 flies fast, making good time. So good that it reaches the refuel point well before its tanker.
They tried to get there as quickly as they could, but obviously we weren't going to slow down for them. So we told them, hey, thank you, but no thanks. We can't slow down enough and make the rendezvous with you.
Bufton has enough gas to fly for 8 more hours, but he's got 12 to go. The crew quickly comes up with a plan B. There's one more chance to tank up over England.
We only needed to hit 1 tanker. However, that made the one air refueling that much more critical because you're really putting all of your eggs in one basket.
80 miles to the rendezvous point, Bufton checks in with the tanker and learns that he's flying right into trouble. The radar shows a massive weather system heading across England and right into the C-17's path.
The thing that we were concerned about was the thunderstorms. You don't want to fly through thunderstorms. I think you learn that in pilot training. Flying through thunderstorms is bad because it'll tear your airplane apart and the wings will fall off and then you'll crash and die.
Flying through the storms could be deadly. With the wounded soldier in the back, flying above them isn't an option either.
The medical team restricted us to a flying altitude of 26,000 feet. So that's where some of the problems came in to the flight.
The C-17 must find the tanker in the middle of a dangerous storm or lose precious time by gassing up on land.
When it comes to flying, you can't pull off the side of the road and think about it. So you have maybe two options, and neither one of them are optimal.
Buffton rolls the dice and makes his choice.
You've got a dude with a giant head wound in the back, so yeah, there's a little bit of stress involved in it. We weren't going to make it to the United States if we didn't get the air refueling taken care of.
If the C-17 doesn't refuel quickly, it can kiss this mission and the soldier's life goodbye. Major Corbett Buffton and his C-17 crew prepare for an emergency refuel over England. Violent thunderstorms threaten their plan.
Weather's critical because you can't close in on the tanker if you're in reduced visibility. It's a critical thing, air refueling, two giant airplanes literally linked up to each other. It's dangerous.
In the C-17's cargo, the life of a gravely wounded soldier is on the line.
The medical team asked us to minimize turbulence as much as possible. So as a result, we were overly concerned about any thunderstorms or getting close to thunderstorms.
Buffton spots the tanker through the storm. The C-17 approaches at a foot per second. Its fuel receptacle is just 8 inches wide. This time, it's a lock. The refueling goes as planned.
There was quite a bit of relief. We were glad that the hardest part was done because that was really like the last thing that was truly critical. We just had to get the gas.
The C-17 rushes westward. 22 hours after takeoff, it banks into Andrews Air Force Base. An ambulance meets them on the runway. Within minutes, medics have the wounded soldier. They race him to Walter Reed Hospital. Thanks to C-17 transport, he survives. The C-17 is the Air Force's premier medevac transport. Over 98% of the wounded who make it onto an aircraft in the field survive.
There are guys getting injured right now that need transport all the way back home. So the fact that I was able to just have a small piece and participate in that was nice.
In the Air Force, fighters and bombers are the shakers, but transport aircraft are the movers. They haul almost 700,000 tons of cargo for the U.S. every year.
Military transport really came into being in the early 1920s, 1930s.
Robert van der Linden is the chairman of the National Air and Space Museum's Aeronautics Department.
Starting in the late 20s, there was just a revolution in technology. Very quickly, that's incorporated in commercial designs, particularly the DC-2 and the DC-3, that could carry significant payloads.
Commercial airliners are the first to take advantage of the new technology. By World War II, the military catches on to it as well.
In World War II, military air transport really came into its own. It became an extremely valuable part of the battlefield and a part of supplying the Allied troops all around the world.
By the end of the war, airlift is a key part of military planning. So key, it's soon called to perform a mission that will change the course of history. 1948, Berlin. Relations between Western allies and the Soviet Union take a turn for the worse. In June, Soviet forces block access to Allied-controlled areas. The Russians want the entire city under communist control.
There was some economic reforms that were being proposed for the Western zone. The Soviets did not want these reforms to take place, so they shut down all the ground access to Berlin.
It's the first international crisis of the Cold War. World War III is a very real threat. As the months go on, the situation gets worse.
The city's now cut off from coal, cut off from food, so obviously they're headed towards a crisis. and there seemed to be no way of bringing coal and large amounts of flour and the like into Berlin.
The Soviets appear to have the upper hand. Then the Allies come up with a novel plan.
Their strategy was to implement an airlift, a massive airlift.
Food, milk, coal, gasoline. West Berliners need 35,000 tons of these supplies every single day. An airlift this big has never been done. The Soviets bet it never will.
The Soviets assumed that there was no way that you could supply a city of over 2 million people simply by air. You need railroad cars to move these supplies. There's no way airplanes can do it.
The Allies' plan gets off to a rocky start.
It didn't work all that well. It wasn't very well coordinated, and it was very clear they were not moving enough supplies.
Enter General William Tunner. Using a fleet of 225 C-54s, he hatches a plan to outsmart the Soviets.
General William Tunner came in and immediately streamlined the operation. They had, within weeks, the system running like clockwork.
Tunner's airlift drops 2.3 million pounds of supplies. 11 months later, the Soviet Union lifts the blockade. Its stranglehold on West Berlin defeated.
It was a huge triumph. It established that the military airlift was every bit as an important aspect of air power as a strategic bombardment.
Over the next 20 years, the Pentagon's inventory of transport planes grows.
Obtaining additional air transport mobility will better assure the ability of our conventional forces to respond to any problem at any spot on the globe at any moment's notice.
There's strategic aircraft, like the C-5 and the C-141 Starlifter. Heavy haulers that take cargo from the United States to bases behind the battle zones.
Strategic is more long distance. Strategic military transport could carry a great deal of material and have the capability of aerial refueling.
But the strategic planes are too big and unwieldy to get into battle. Once the cargo arrives, it's unloaded and reconfigured for the tactical planes. The C-130 Hercules, the C-123 Provider, the C-7 Caribou, light lifters that bring it all to the front lines.
The tactical is shorter range, much more flexible. It's usually a smaller airplane intended to get in and out of more challenging runways or just sometimes just open fields.
Throughout the Cold War, getting cargo to the battlefield is a two-step process. That's one step too many when troops are in need.
The military had excellent tactical transports and they had excellent long-range strategic transports, but they had an increasing need for a more flexible design that could do significant elements of both requirements.
November 1979, Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. Major General Emil Bloch forms a team to come up with a new design. He calls it the CX program for cargo experimental aircraft.
The CX program began with a requirement definition, and it was combined a strategic and tactical mission.
Major Bill Norton was a lead test engineer for the C-17 program.
To not have to land at a major airfield, repackage or break down the cargo, reload it into another airplane would mean a tremendous reduction in time.
The design team's first mandate, the new plane has to be rugged enough to get to the front lines.
The CX requirement included STOL, the short takeoff and landing. So if you're going to fly into a forward area, airfields are generally going to be pretty short, 2,000, 3,000 feet long.
That's the tactical requirement. But the new plane's design must also fulfill a strategic need for payload.
They needed an airplane that could move an Abrams tank directly to a battlefield. If you can do that, then you can carry the trucks and the smaller equipment.
January 1981, the Pentagon. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed submit proposals for the new air transport plane. 8 months later, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger announces the winner, McDonnell Douglas. the new plane must be operational within 6 years.
It was a very complex program to begin with, very challenging technologically, and there was a lot of fear that we'd spend billions of dollars on something that may not pan out.
The fears prove well-founded. Building the plane is even harder than they thought.
You wouldn't think a transport's that expensive, but developing a very, very sophisticated airplane, a very capable plane, and takes a lot of work.
McDonnell Douglas planned a very optimistic flight test program of 22 months. Within a year and a half, it was clear that 22 months was not going to work.
Problems mount, and so do the costs. The program is soon over budget by $500 million.
The C-17 is a $40 billion boondoggle, and according to my friend Ed Jenkins, nothing more but a town car for the Air Force.
Well, the C-17 had enemies in Congress primarily because of the cost overruns. And members of Congress were asking, is the American taxpayer getting his money's worth?
Government's actually going to pay out more money for 120 aircraft than it was originally going to pay for 210 aircraft.
Some were thinking, no, the taxpayer wasn't. And maybe we just cut your losses and move on to something else.
September 15th, 1991. Boeing Airfield, Long Beach, California. The C-17 gets ready to make its debut. The Air Force is there to support its struggling program.
The Department of Defense was under tremendous pressure to ensure that this airplane came together.
It's a do-or-die milestone. Contractor McDonnell Douglas feels the pressure too.
The fact that they could demonstrate that they could actually take to the air and fly well was extremely important to the program.
On first sight, the C-17 makes a big impression. It's 174 feet long, 55 feet tall, with a wingspan of 170 feet. The cockpit is 25 feet above the ground. This huge plane has the smallest crew requirement of any Air Force transport, just 2 pilots and a loadmaster. It's designed to be easy to fly.
It's a fairly large aircraft and handles like a much smaller airplane. Very maneuverable.
The C-17 has to be maneuverable. Short takeoff and landings demand it. Control systems designed for fighters help.
Right in front of me is the heads-up display, the HUD. The HUD is typically found in a fighter aircraft like the F-16, but heavy airlift to have a HUD is very unusual.
The HUD gathers crucial information and projects it onto a screen in the pilot's line of sight.
It gives us airspeed, altitude, flight path vector, which keeps us safe and tactical when we need to be looking outside the aircraft instead of inside during critical phases of flight.
The HUD gives the C-17 eyes like a fighter. It has the technology to steer like one, too.
The C-17 is the only heavy airlift aircraft in the Air Force that has a stick. It allows us to fly the C-17 with precision. It allows us to control our turns as well as any spot landings that we need to perform.
Advanced avionics make the C-17 look impressive on the ground. But as it lumbers onto the Boeing airfield, it must prove itself in the air.
The first flight was important. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. A lot of surprises can arise.
The new transport taxis down the runway and lifts off.
The airplane configured for cruise, flew over the mountains, configured for landing, landed well, rolled out, taxied in. So it went off very well.
From the outside, it's a success. But just below the surface, trouble.
We found fuel leaks around the engine mount at the end of the pylon where all the fuel lines came out to the engine.
And then the aircraft developed some problems in the wings, and it's like, well, it just means it's going to cost more.
Poor construction, rising costs. Just when it seemed to be back on track, the C-17 program takes a dive. July 1995. Joint Air Force Base, Charleston, South Carolina. McDonnell Douglas has one last chance to redeem its failing plane. 8 C-17s undergo 30 days of rigorous testing. McDonnell Douglas is determined to save its baby from the scrap heap.
They operated this handful of airplanes to its limits, flying them nearly around the clock. They did airdrop. They landed out in the desert and offloaded tanks. They did just about everything. They found the airplane essentially met all of its requirements and exceeded many.
The aeronautics world is impressed, so impressed that they give the C-17 the Collier Trophy for Aeronautical Achievement. It's a major change of heart.
It was now entering service, but no one really knew how well it would perform until it was actually performing under combat situations. And that opportunity came in 1999 in the Balkans.
Eastern Europe erupts into violence. Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic sends his militants on an ethnic cleansing campaign.
Tens of thousands of ethnic Albanians are once again pouring out of Kosovo province.
NATO must mobilize its forces quickly and bring in the infrastructure.
All the personnel, medical supplies, everything needed to support a task force for an indefinite period out in a very austere environment had to be flown in. There was no other way to get it there.
The closest airfield is in Renas, Albania. It's far from ideal.
The Renas airfield was one of those relatively short, narrow fields, very austere, little more than a fuel truck in a little building serving as a terminal. The airfields were fairly narrow, so an airplane was needed that could bring in high capacity, high volume cargo, wide cargo, turn around and get out just as quickly as it landed.
Renas is the perfect proving ground for the new aircraft. Short takeoffs and landings are supposed to be its specialty.
The plane was built to get into weird places, so we can basically get in and out of anywhere.
To take off, the C-17 relies on 4 powerful engines.
So what enables the short field takeoffs is these big engines right here. They're Pratt & Whitney F-117 engines, and they produce roughly 40,000 pounds of thrust per engine.
That's 160,000 pounds of power, reined in by 12 all-carbon brakes.
We'll hold the brakes, run the engines up to max power. We'll take off in a very short distance, and we can actually climb almost straight up.
To land, the C-17 uses something called propulsive lift system. Key to that are the flaps on its wings.
Basically, we can put those almost all the way down, pointed towards the ground, and our engine thrust will actually hit that, and it's directed downwards to the ground. So instead of pulling back when we land, we kind of controlled crash it into the ground.
The C-17 is over 500,000 pounds fully loaded. It can come to a full stop in just 1,400 feet.
Our brakes are absolutely amazing, and once we hit those, it's got like an anti-lock brake system on it, and we can't even feel it. We just go full forward on the brakes and our aircraft stops.
Pilots claim that flying the C-17 is like dancing with a 280,000-pound ballerina.
So if you were to ask any C-17 pilot, probably what they love the most about the aircraft is just how it flies and what you can do with it. I mean, the sheer power of the aircraft is amazing. You can get in and out of anywhere you choose.
In Germany's Ramstein airfield, C-17s load up and take off for Renas. All eyes are on the big gray moose as it glides into the tiny airfield. Every landing goes off without a hitch. It's as if the C-17 had been doing it for years.
The C-17 came out of it looking pretty good. It was credited with much higher reliability than all the other military transports.
Over the next month, the C-17s bring in 10,300 pieces of equipment on 550 flights. 14 70-ton M1A1 Abrams tanks, 42 Bradley fighting vehicles, 20 5-ton expandable vans, 190 containers of ammunition. Even Congress admits that its money was well spent.
Without the C-17 in the inventory today, there is no way that we could be doing in the Kosovo region what we are doing.
Was able to bring massive amounts of supplies in very tight airfields, some very challenging airfields. Fields only about 3,000 feet long.
The C-17 proves it can get cargo in where others can't. In its next mission, it will have to prove that it can deliver without landing at all. 2001, Afghanistan. Operation Enduring Freedom. A month after the September 11th attacks, President George W. Bush orders strikes against Taliban military posts and training camps throughout the country.
More than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands. None of these demands were met. And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
America plans more than a big stick, also a carrot.
Whatever military response we had, there was going to be a humanitarian component to it as well.
Colonel William Chanjos was a C-17 pilot during relief operations in Afghanistan.
Our mission was to deliver humanitarian food to the poor and displaced people of Afghanistan. We wanted to make sure that the people of the world and in Afghanistan knew that the U.S. was going against the Taliban and not against the people of Afghanistan.
The military and humanitarian flights are timed for the very same night. To supply the aid, the Air Force turns to one of their biggest assets, the C-17. October 2001, Ramstein Air Base, Germany. 2 C-17 crews take off for Afghanistan. Normally, they'd head straight for the front lines. This time, that isn't an option.
First night of the war, we didn't have control of anything. The airfields were not open yet. There were runways, but they were firmly in Taliban hands.
Commanders can't bring the food over ground, so they come up with a radical plan, an airdrop.
It was the first time a C-17 had done an airdrop in a combat situation.
Keyword, combat. The Taliban doesn't care if the C-17s fly a relief mission. They just see a target.
We had no doubt that there would be people with what's called man-portable missiles, a shoulder-launched missile. And of course they had small arms, a bunch of rifles and big guns that they could shoot up in the air. So our goal was to stay above all that stuff.
To stay above the threat, the C-17s will have to fly at 28,000 feet. It's the highest airdrop that any transport aircraft has ever done.
These high-altitude airdrops were really the only way to get in that territory. We wouldn't lose planes and crews while trying to do humanitarian action.
Flying high solves one problem, but it creates another. As long as the plane is sealed, altitude isn't a problem. It's when the cargo doors open that things get ugly.
A standard airplane was pressurized. There's a lot of pressure on the locks that hook the door to the airplane and keep the doors closed. In order to open up those locks, you have to depressurize the airplane.
Depressurize at 12,000 feet and crews don't even feel it. Do it any higher, and the air can turn deadly.
What ends up happening is the nitrogen will come out of your blood, it will accumulate in your joints, it can be crippling.
Only one thing can keep the crews safe: oxygen.
We decided that we would put on oxygen 1 hour prior to the scheduled airdrop. Breathing pure oxygen was to get the nitrogen out of the blood, and we figured we needed at least an hour to do that.
10 hours into their flight, Lieutenant Colonel Chanjos gives his crew the signal to put on their masks.
You make sure everybody heard that because it was important. It was vital, life-threatening if you didn't.
Chanjos opens the cargo doors.
All clear, pilot.
He lifts the C-17's nose up 7 degrees to help ease the cargo out of the hold.
2, 1, green light.
This type of airdrop is a gravity airdrop. In other words, the packages, the bundles are in the back of the airplane, and at a predetermined time, they roll out the back.
So far, so good.
All clear, load.
But when Chanjos tries to close the cargo doors, he notices something wrong.
And
Doors are closed by a series of latches that are lubricated with standard grease. We did not think to change the lubrication in the back of the locks to account for these cold temperatures. So after the doors had been open for 10 to 15 minutes, the lubricant froze, and therefore the latches wouldn't work as designed.
If the C-17's doors won't close, Chanjos can't repressurize the cabin. Suddenly, the mission goes from good to possibly deadly. High above Afghanistan, Lieutenant Colonel William Chanjos pilots a C-17. In the back, his loadmasters struggle to close the cargo doors.
The loadmasters are literally banging the latches to get them to rotate and lock the doors closed.
Freezing air quickly fills up the cargo hold.
At that altitude, the temperature's about 40 degrees below zero. Very, very cold. We were afraid they're actually going to get frostbite. Now we're saying, okay, so now what do we do? We only had limited oxygen on board. We had enough for about 4 hours, and we could not have completed our flight at altitude on 4 hours of oxygen.
Chanjos's crew sucks down oxygen at the rate of 8 liters per minute. The loadmasters know that the oxygen won't last long.
They are wearing a harness so they don't fall out the back. They're wearing their oxygen mask, and it's really cold. It was probably the most dangerous part of the mission.
Finally, they managed to muscle the door shut. The pilots quickly repressurized the cabin. All 7 crew members breathe in pressurized air and exhale a sigh of relief.
If the loadmasters had not gotten the doors closed, we would have had to divert someplace unplanned with a couple of C-17s on the first night of the war.
Chanjos and his crew head back to base. They've put 35,000 humanitarian daily rations into the hands of hungry Afghanis.
It just makes you feel good to know that you actually are able to get food directly to people who need it, who hadn't had this sort of good fortune in a long time. That was good. The cargo flying and supply mission, it is never the pointy end of the spear, as we call it. It's always a support mission. This was a really great mission because we actually were right there in the eye of the storm.
Chanjos's mission is the highest nighttime combat airdrop in Air Force history.
No other plane could have done it. No other plane could have got as high and carried as much cargo as the C-17.
The C-17 proves it can bring in the goods. On its next mission, it must show it can drop in an even more challenging cargo: soldiers. 2003, all eyes are on Iraq and dictator Saddam Hussein. President George W. Bush claims Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. Saddam knows he has no such weapons. While the United Nations decides what to do, the U.S. and its allies count down to war.
Saddam Hussein is not cooperating with the inspectors and therefore is in breach of the UN resolution. And that's why time is running out.
Operation Iraqi Freedom starts in March. Coalition troops move in quickly from the south. The plan is to assault the north from a staging ground in Turkey. But there's a problem.
Leading up to the airdrop, Turkey had said that they may not permit us to cross the border from Turkey into Iraq for offensive combat operations.
Colonel Shane Hirschman was a C-17 squadron commander in Operation Iraqi Freedom.
When Turkey was saying the Army couldn't go across from Turkey into Iraq, we had to come up with a plan that we could secure that area so we could have operations against any enemy on the ground.
To establish a northern front, Allies need another option. If they can't get the troops in over land, they'll get them in through the air. Aviano Air Base, Italy. Hirschman and 14 other C-17 crews load up the aircraft as they make their final plans.
We determined it was going to be a 15-ship airdrop. It was going to be 5 aircraft leading it with the heavy equipment, and then 10 aircraft loaded with 1,000 jumpers.
Jumpers, paratroopers. It's their job to secure the area and be ready to fight just as soon as they land. Airdropping soldiers into Iraq is risky business. Saddam's forces have enough surface-to-air missiles to blow the C-17s and their 1,000 jumpers right out of the sky.
Some of the missile systems can reach up pretty far, even the shoulder-launched missiles. And so our biggest concern was stay high as long as possible.
If the C-17s succeed, it will be the largest nighttime single-pass airdrop since D-Day. If they fail, the war may be lost before it's begun. Just before midnight, 15 C-17s take off for the flight into Iraq. Pilots rely on night vision goggles, making a tough mission even harder.
One of our operating procedures in the threat environment is we go lights out. We just did not want somebody on the ground to be able to see the lights of the aircraft and give us away.
4 B-52s and 6 F-18s accompany Hirschman's squadron. Without them, the C-17s are sitting ducks.
It was reassuring. Since we're unarmed, we don't really have a way to engage anything coming at us.
The C-17s fly in a tight formation. It's nearly 5 long hours to the drop zone. Plenty of time to worry about what can go wrong.
The drop zone was near the town of Bashir, where you have high terrain. So some of the concerns we had to work through and plan for were the terrain was our first one.
The C-17s have to navigate 2 sets of mountains to reach the drop zone. One to the north and one to the south. The drop zone is a small plateau in between. To put the troops in position, the C-17s have to descend 24,000 feet, make the drop, and bank back up at a 90-degree angle. All in under 5 minutes.
Just the basics of it. It's tough. I mean, there's a lot of variables involved.
The maneuver is tricky enough for one C-17, but for a formation of 15, it's even more complicated.
The hardest part is formation integrity. Keep your position in a formation. If the number 2 plane would start his turn a little bit earlier than the number 1 plane, he's closing in that plane. You could have a mid-air collision, so it has to be precise.
Pilots control the front-end operations, but in the cargo, it's the C-17's loadmaster who calls the shots.
Every C-17 flies with a loadmaster, and our primary responsibility is to upload and download cargo.
When the C-17's cargo is soldiers, there's another crew member on board too.
When we do personnel airdrops, we work with a jump master, and the jump master is in charge of all the jumpers.
10 minutes away from the drop zone, the pilot tells the loadmaster to get ready. The loadmaster opens the doors and cues the jump master to get his troops ready to drop. The loadmaster starts the countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We signal time signals to the jump master that in turn passes it to the jumpers so they know when to be ready.
Then it's go time. Gear up, feet up, the troops jump. Jump master and loadmaster. It's a relationship practiced in peace, but forged by war.
When you're operating with the cargo doors open, it is key to make sure that everyone is on the right page, to make sure that nothing goes wrong.
Over Iraq, Hirschman tells his loadmaster to get ready. The mission computer alerts them that it's nearly drop time.
The mission computer does the counting for you, and then the green light will come on, and we'll release the load for the heavy equipments, and the green light means the jumpers are cleared to jump out the doors.
The C-17s start their descent. Suddenly, Hirschman gets a radio call from one of the F-18s.
Right as we were getting ready to start our turn to the drop zone, the Navy fighters called in and said that there was fire coming up, and they were going to go engage them.
Now the C-17s are on their own, vulnerable at the mission's most crucial moment.
We were so busy with acquiring the drop zone, keeping the formation, we just concentrated on getting the airdrop done.
The C-17s drop quickly, on high alert for enemy fire. The computer begins its countdown, but Hirschman notices a problem.
As we made our turn and got lined up with the drop axis, I looked out and noticed that the drop zone was different than the coordinates that we had put in the mission computer where the drop was going to be.
The computer's calculations are off by at least 1,000 feet. If Hirschman lets the computer call the drop, the troops could crash into the mountains, or worse, end up in enemy hands. 15 C-17s make a rapid descent over a rock. Inside, 1,000 American paratroopers get ready to open up Iraq's northern front. But then, Colonel Shane Hirschman notices the drop calculation is wrong.
I mean, in seconds here, trying to decide what are we going to do on this. I think we were within a minute when I told the co-pilot that they're going to transition to a manual drop.
In manual drop, the pilot has only his sight to guide him. Not easy when he's executing a tricky maneuver over enemy territory at night.
The pilot's got to pay attention to how the formation was looking how our alignment looked, monitoring everything, plus the possible threat and everything else.
Hirschman has just moments to recalculate the drop and relay it to the other 14 aircraft, or abort the mission.
So you're in that descent, night vision goggles, trying to acquire the drop zone and checking out the whole formation and making sure that we could start our slow down for the drop.
Hirschman takes one last look through his night vision goggles and makes the call. One by one, the C-17s unload.
You can actually hear the jumpers running down the floor. You can hear that noise as they're going out the door, and then it'll get quiet.
Minutes later, more than 3 tons of equipment and 1,000 American troops are on the ground.
It was big relief. It was the national interest said we're going to be done, and everybody got in and out safe. It was rewarding.
During the next 96 hours, C-17s airlift more than 400 vehicles, 2,000 soldiers, and 3,000 tons of equipment.
We flew 47 more air-land missions in the next 4 days to supply them with the rest of the force that they need so they could continue to push south into Baghdad.
The C-17's success in Iraqi freedom is just another notch in its jumbo-wide belt.
It has paid for itself over and over again. I mean, it's just amazing. It can do anything.
2015, Long Beach, California. Boeing prepares to assemble the 279th C-17. After 25 years in production, the big gray moose has reached the end of the production line. But it's still writing its future.
There's a lot of history still ahead on the C-17. They've shown that they can meet all the operational requirements demanded of them in combat environments, and we may see it doing even more things than it has been in the past.
There are 257 C-17s in service worldwide, including Australia, Canada, India, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, and the NATO's Strategic Airlift Capability Initiative.
One of the other legacies is that we're also selling this airplane to foreign nations. So about 45 to 49 of these airplanes are in service with about 6 other nations. What that says is that they have high confidence in the reliability of the airplane and the reliability of the Americans to undergo overhauls and things like that.
It took more than 20 years to convince its critics that the C-17 was fit to fly. But 30 years later, it's still going strong.
Most of us involved in the development had high confidence in it and understood it would take time for all the kinks to be worked out and for it to prove itself. And all that's happened. Just a matter of patience and confidence.
The C-17 has more than 2.6 million flying hours to its credit.
The life of a military transport is a very hard one, and they're used constantly and they're used very hard. and they endure a lot.
The C-17 has been the center part of Air Mobility Command now since 1993, and so it's been going and nonstop.
It's the Air Force's transport of choice in almost every worldwide operation. In Afghanistan, there are no rail networks. Convoys can't come in from adjoining nations. The U.S. military has never been so dependent on air transport. It's like sustaining the Berlin airlift year after year.
It's probably the backbone for a lot of the operations that are going on right now and will be for a long time into the future.
Reliability is fantastic, and it's really easy to fly and fun to fly. It's the greatest plane I've ever flown.
Speed, flexibility, range, responsiveness, payload. The C-17 Globemaster continues to show it's worth its weight.